Blood is supposed to mean something. Ashby Thistlewood forgot that the day he handed his mother a single moving box and told her she had until Friday. Marigold thought she'd raised a good man. What she actually raised was about to hand her the coldest winter of her life, and then, without meaning to, the very thing that would burn his whole world down. Days after she vanished from Marrow's End, whispers started about a light on the cliffs that hadn't worked in 40 years, suddenly working again. Nobody knew why. Nobody knew what she'd found inside it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marigold Thistlewood was 61 years old when her son sat her down at the kitchen table she'd bought with her own wages 30 years earlier and told her the house needed to go on the market. "It's not personal, Mom," Ashby said, not looking up from his phone. "Seraphina and I talked it through. With the kids starting school, we need the equity." The house wasn't in Marigold's name. That had been the arrangement after her husband died, back when Ashby was 24 and freshly married and full of promises about taking care of everything, so she wouldn't have to worry. She'd signed the deed over to him for tax reasons, he'd said. It would protect the family. She trusted him because he was her son, and because for a while, it even seemed to work out fine. Seraphina Wrexham stood by the counter, arms crossed, watching this unfold like she was supervising a transaction rather than witnessing the end of her mother-in-law's life as she knew it. "You'll find somewhere," Seraphina offered. "There's assisted living out past the highway. Reasonable rates. I looked it up." Marigold set down her tea. Her hand didn't shake, which surprised her, because everything else in her chest felt like it was collapsing. "Assisted living," she repeated. "I'm 61, not 90. It's just an option," Ashby said. "You've got savings. Dad's pension. You'll be fine." The pension had stopped the year prior. Some clause about remarriage clauses and beneficiary status that Marigold had never fully understood, and Ashby had promised to sort out and never had. Her savings were $11,000. She knew this number the way she knew her own birthday. "Where exactly am I supposed to go by Friday?" she asked. Ashby finally looked up. There was something in his face she hadn't seen since he was a teenager, lying about where he'd been, a flicker of guilt quickly smothered by irritation at being questioned. "That's not really our problem to solve for you, Mom. You're an adult." The realtor sign went up 2 days later. Marigold watched from the front step as a young woman in a blazer hammered it into the lawn, right into the flower bed Marigold had planted the spring after her husband's funeral. Peonies. They just started blooming. Neighbors noticed. Of course they noticed. Mrs. Okonkwo from 2 doors down came by with a casserole and a face full of pity that was somehow worse than anything Ashby had said directly. "You could stay with family," Mrs. Okonkwo offered gently. "Is my family," Marigold said, and heard how strange that sounded out loud. By Thursday night, Marigold had packed 1 suitcase and a duffel bag. Everything else, 3 decades of furniture, photo albums, her late husband's tools still hanging in the garage, would either be sold with the house or hauled to a storage unit Ashby said he'd handle eventually. She didn't believe him. She was learning, slowly and painfully, that she shouldn't have believed a lot of things. Her dog, Ember, an old red heeler with a graying muzzle and 1 bad hip, sat by the suitcase like she understood exactly what was happening. Maybe she did. Dogs pick up on more than people give them credit for. Friday morning, Ashby helped carry her bags to the curb. He didn't offer her a ride anywhere. He didn't ask where she was going. He just stood there in his work clothes, checking his watch, while Seraphina waited in the running car with the windows up. "I'll call you," Ashby said. "Once things settle." "Settle," Marigold said. "Is that what we're calling this? Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to remind him of every soccer practice she'd driven him to, every fever she'd sat up with, every dollar she'd stretched so he could have the childhood his father's modest salary couldn't quite cover on its own. Instead, she picked up Ember's leash, gripped the handle of her suitcase, and said nothing at all, because some betrayals are too large for words to hold. She walked 3 blocks before she let herself cry. Then she stopped, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and kept walking because crying wasn't going to solve the fact that she had $11,000, one suitcase, an aging dog, and absolutely nowhere in the world that was hers. By late afternoon, her feet ached, and Ember was limping badly enough that Marigold had to carry her for stretches. They'd made it to the edge of town, past the last row of houses, out where the road ran along the coastline and the wind carried salt instead of the smell of other people's dinners cooking. She sat down on a rock to let Ember rest, and that was when she noticed it, half swallowed by overgrown brush at the top of the bluff. A lighthouse, dark, weathered, clearly abandoned for decades. And somehow, impossibly, it was the first thing all day that didn't feel like it belonged to someone else. The lighthouse stood at the edge of a rocky point, cut off from the main road by a stretch of dune grass and a rusted chain that had long since lost any authority to stop anyone. A sign nailed to a post read Thornwick Light, decommissioned, with a date so weathered Marigold couldn't make out the year. Below it, in fresher paint, someone had clearly given up on enforcing. Another sign warned of trespassing penalties. Marigold looked at Ember, whose hip was clearly bothering her, then looked at the darkening sky, then looked at the $11,000 sitting in a bank account that would not last long in any motel in Marrow's End. "We're not trespassing," she told the dog. "We're resting. There's a difference." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She climbed over the chain and made her way up the path, mostly grown over with seagrass and wild rose bushes that scratched at her ankles. The lighthouse itself was taller than it looked from the road, maybe 60 feet, built from stone the color of old bone, with a rusted iron door at its base that hung slightly open, as if someone, decades ago, had left in a hurry and never come back to finish closing it. Marigold pushed the door the rest of the way open. It groaned against hinges that hadn't moved in years. Inside, the air smelled like salt and dust, and something faintly metallic, the way old buildings smell when they've been sealed away from the world for a long time. A spiral staircase wound upward into darkness. Iron steps bolted to the curved stone wall. She had a small flashlight in her purse, the kind she'd kept there since Ashby was small and prone to power outages during storms. She clicked it on and shone it around the base of the lighthouse. Empty mostly. A few crates rotted through, a coil of rope stiff with age, and against one wall, what looked like it had once been a small keeper's office, a desk, a chair, a shelf, still holding a handful of waterlogged logbooks. Ember sniffed the corners cautiously, then, apparently satisfied, lay down on the cold stone floor with a heavy sigh, the kind of sigh that said she was done walking for the day regardless of what her owner decided next. "All right," Marigold said. One night. She climbed the spiral stairs slowly, testing each one before putting her full weight down. 31 steps, she counted, before she reached a landing with a door leading into what must have been the keeper's living quarters, a small round room that matched the curve of the tower. A single window, thick with grime, let in the last gray light of the evening. There was a stone hearth built into one wall, long cold, and a built-in bed frame with nothing on it but dust and a few dead leaves that had blown in through a crack somewhere. It was cold. It was empty. It was also, Marigold realized as she stood there catching her breath, the first room in 3 decades that belonged to no one but her. She went back down for Ember and the bags, made 3 trips in total, her arms burning by the last one. By the time she'd hauled everything up, true dark had fallen outside, and the wind had picked up, whistling faintly through gaps somewhere higher in the tower. She found an old wool blanket in her duffel bag, the one she'd grabbed on instinct while packing, and spread it over the bed frame. It wasn't much. It was enough for one night. She lit a candle she'd bought at the last gas station before the road turned coastal, set it on the windowsill, and sat down on the edge of the bed frame with Ember curled against her side. "This is insane," she said out loud, to no one, to the dog, to the 4 stone walls that had no opinion on the matter one way or another. But underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the disbelief that her own son had done this to her, there was something else, something she almost didn't recognize because it had been absent from her life for so long. Quiet, actual quiet, not the performative silence of a house where everyone was simply waiting for her to leave the room. Nobody here was going to tell her she was too much, too old, too inconvenient. Nobody here was going to hand her a box and a deadline. She slept better that night than she had in months, curled on a bare bed frame in a stone tower on the edge of a cliff, with the sound of the ocean instead of Ashby's voice in her ears. She woke at dawn to gray light through the grimy window and the sound of gulls. For a moment, she forgot where she was, and then she remembered, and instead of the panic she expected, she felt something closer to resolve. She had $11,000. She had a dog who needed her. She had a lighthouse nobody wanted, and a body that, despite everything, still worked. Marigold sat up, wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and made a decision that would have shocked the version of herself who'd left the house on Friday morning believing she had nothing left to lose. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. Maybe not for a long while. By her third day at Thornwick Light, Marigold had stopped thinking of it as trespassing and started thinking of it as home, in the loose, provisional way a person thinks of anything when the alternative is nothing at all. The first problem was water. She'd used what she had in her bag sparingly, but a person and a dog can only survive so long on 4 bottles of water and a thermos. She walked the 2 miles into Marrow's Inn that morning, keeping to the tree line where she could, and found a gas station with a bathroom nobody questioned her using. She filled 2 empty jugs from the sink, bought as much bottled water as she could carry, and on the walk back noticed a public spigot behind the old fish market, unlocked, apparently forgotten by whoever was supposed to be charging for its use. She marked it in her memory. Free water, half a mile closer than the gas station. Small victories mattered now. The second problem was food, and this one she solved with more creativity than she expected of herself. The fish market threw out crates of ice each evening when they closed, ice that had kept the morning catch cold, but was no longer needed once the shop shuttered. Marigold began timing her walks to catch the tail end of closing, and more than once found herself accepting, then genuinely grateful for, bruised produce and day-old bread that a small grocer 2 streets over set out by the dumpster rather than the trash bin itself. A small mercy she suspected was intentional. She was 50 pounds of pride poorer by the end of that first week. She got over it faster than she expected. The third problem, the one that mattered most as the nights grew colder, was heat and light. The stone hearth in the keeper's quarters still had its flue intact. She discovered after cautiously testing it with a lit match and watching the smoke draw upward instead of back into the room. Driftwood was abundant along the rocks below the lighthouse, salt-bleached and dry enough to burn if she was patient about gathering it. She spent an entire afternoon hauling armfuls up the cliff path, stacking it against the far wall of the keeper's room. And that night, she had her first real fire in the hearth, small and careful, but enough to take the edge off the chill coming through the stone. Ember loved the fire more than anything else in their strange new life. She'd position herself as close to the hearth as safety allowed and dozed there for hours, one ear occasionally swiveling toward some sound only she could hear. Light was harder. Candles burned fast and cost money she needed for other things. On her 4th trip into town, Marigold found the public library, a squat brick building with a reading room that stayed open until 7 and had outlets nobody monitored. She bought 2 cheap battery lanterns and a handful of rechargeable batteries from the hardware store, spending far more than she wanted to, but reasoning it as an investment. Each afternoon, she'd sit in the library reading room with her batteries plugged in, ostensibly reading the newspaper, actually recharging the only light source she'd have once the sun went down over the water. It became a rhythm within 2 weeks. Wake at dawn. Walk the cliff path down to check the tide pools for mussels, which she learned to identify safely after an afternoon spent in the library reading a coastal foraging guide cover to cover. Walk into town mid-morning for water and whatever the grocer had set aside. Spend the early afternoon in the library, charging batteries, reading, staying warm. Walk back before dusk to gather driftwood and start the evening fire. It was exhausting in a way her old life never had been. It was also, strangely, the first schedule in years that belonged entirely to her. She began cleaning the keeper's quarters properly in her 2nd week. once the basics were handled. Decades of dust came up with a rag and buckets of seawater hauled up from the rocks below, not drinkable, but perfectly fine for scrubbing stone. Underneath the grime, the room had good bones. A built-in cabinet along one wall, warped but sturdy. A small iron stove separate from the hearth, rusted but salvageable, that she suspected had once been used for cooking. The window, once she'd scraped years of salt film from the glass, let in a startling amount of light, and looking through it, she could see clear across the water to where the fishing boats came in each morning. She found furniture the way Sarah in that other story might have found it, except Marigold's version of curbside treasure was driftwood and storm debris and the occasional item left behind by whoever had used the Lighthouse grounds as an informal dumping ground over the decades. A wooden crate became a side table once she sanded the rough edges. A stretch of canvas tarp, found tangled in the rocks after a storm, became a makeshift rug once she'd washed the salt out of it 3 separate times. By the end of her 3rd week, the keeper's quarters no longer looked like an abandoned room. It looked lived in, sparse, certainly, and cold in a way that no fire fully solved, but lived in, with a bed frame properly made up, a small fire always ready to be lit, and a dog who'd claimed the warmest corner as her own. Marigold sat by the hearth one evening, mending a tear in her coat by lantern light, and did the math on her savings. $11,000, minus what she'd spent so far, which came to just under $900. At this rate, careful and frugal, the money could last years rather than months. She thought of Ashby, probably settling into whatever new arrangement he and Seraphina had made with the equity from her house, and felt something that surprised her by how little it resembled sorrow anymore. It felt like the beginning of an appetite. Not for revenge, not yet. Just for proving, to herself first and everyone else eventually, that she was not the used-up, forgettable woman her own son had decided she was. 6 weeks into her life at Thornwick Light, Marigold Thistlewood did something she hadn't expected to do again in this lifetime. She made something beautiful. It started small. She'd been scrubbing the same section of exterior stone near the tower's base for the better part of an hour, more out of restless energy than any real plan, when the salt-crusted grime finally gave way to reveal a carved inscription she hadn't known was there. A date, 1887, and beneath it, worn nearly smooth by a century of wind, a woman's name. Constance Reyes had not carved it. Obviously, someone from over 100 years earlier had, but Marigold liked to imagine the keeper's wife back then leaving her own small mark on a place the world had otherwise forgotten to credit her for maintaining. That discovery changed something in how she saw the building. It stopped being a shelter she was borrowing and started being a place with its own long, layered history, one she was now simply the latest chapter of. She began scrubbing in earnest after that, not out of necessity, the way the first cleaning had been, but out of something closer to reverence. Section by section, she worked her way around the tower's interior walls, revealing stonework that had been hidden under decades of salt residue and neglect. The keeper's quarters, once she'd finished, had a warmth to the stone she hadn't noticed before, pale gray shot through with veins of rust orange that caught the afternoon light beautifully. Money was still tight, so furniture came the way it always had, through patience and scavenging rather than purchase. A fisherman named Otis, who ran a boat repair stand near the harbor, let her take a stack of weathered boards he'd been meaning to burn, and Marigold spent 3 evenings by firelight sanding them smooth enough to build a proper shelf along the curved wall of her room. She lined it with the logbooks she'd found on her first night, dried out now and legible in places, brittle records of tide charts and ship sightings going back to the 1920s. A woman at the thrift shop in town, after Marigold had come in twice a week for a month buying blankets and mismatched dishware, started setting things aside for her without being asked. A cracked but usable teapot. A wool rug faded from red to a soft rust color that matched the stone almost perfectly. Marigold never explained where she was living, and the woman never asked, which was its own kind of quiet kindness she'd stopped expecting from strangers. By the 7th week, the keeper's quarters had become something Marigold found herself reluctant to leave each morning. The bed frame, Properly assembled now, with a second-hand mattress, she'd hauled up the spiral stairs in 3 exhausting stages, sat beneath the window where morning light spilled across the stone floor. The shelf of logbooks and the few paperback novels she'd collected from a little free library box near the school gave the room the feel of a study rather than a hideout. Even the iron stove worked now, coaxed back to function after she'd spent an afternoon at the library reading about clearing decades-old soot from flue pipes. She started sketching, something she hadn't done since she was a girl. Small drawings in the margins of a notebook she'd bought for $1. The curve of the tower stairs. Ember asleep by the hearth. The way light fell through the window at different hours of the day. She wasn't sure why she was doing it, only that it felt like something she'd been putting off for 30 years without realizing it. It was during this period, in her 7th week, exploring parts of the tower she'd previously left alone out of caution, that Marigold found the sealed door. It was on the level below her own, a landing she'd passed a dozen times without paying much attention, assuming the narrow door built into the curved wall was simply a storage closet, the same as 2 others on that floor which held nothing but empty shelving and a rusted anchor chain coiled in the corner. This door was different. It was iron, not wood, and it was locked, not with a simple latch, but with an actual mechanism, a round dial set into its face, dulled with age, but clearly not decorative. Marigold stood in front of it for a long time that afternoon, running her fingers along the cold metal, tried to imagine what a lighthouse from the 1880s would need a locked vault door for. Records, maybe. Fuel reserves, though that seemed unlikely for something built to withstand a dial lock rather than simple weather. She tried turning the dial a few times, felt it click through numbers with no result, and eventually gave up for the evening, filing the mystery away alongside everything else she hadn't yet had time to solve. That night, sitting by the fire with Ember curled against her side and the wind picking up outside in a way that meant a storm was coming, Marigold heard something that made her go completely still. Footsteps, not the wind moving through the tower's gaps, which she'd long since learned to recognize by sound. These were deliberate, slow, coming from the base of the spiral staircase, working their way upward one careful step at a time. She'd been discovered before, briefly, twice, by teenagers who used the grounds around the lighthouse to drink beer and had fled the moment they saw a light in the window. This felt different. This felt like someone who knew exactly where they were going. Marigold reached over and pinched out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, and sat frozen with one hand resting protectively on Ember's back, listening to the footsteps climb closer. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Marigold sat in the dark, heart hammering, Ember's low growl vibrating against her palm where her hand still rested on the dog's back. A beam of light swept under the door, then the door itself creaked open, and a flashlight beam swung directly into the room, catching her full in the face. "Whoa, hey, I'm not here to hurt you." The voice belonged to a man, older, maybe 70, with a weathered face and a thick canvas coat that marked him as someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He lowered the flashlight immediately once he saw her, angling it toward the floor instead of her eyes. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said. "I'm Bart. Bart Quill. I do inspections out here twice a year, structural checks on the old lights along this stretch of coast. Been doing it since before the county even remembered they were supposed to." Marigold didn't move. Ember's growl hadn't fully stopped, though it had dropped in volume, which she took as a small mercy. "I'm sorry," Marigold said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know I'm not supposed to be here. I'll pack up. Just give me until morning." Bart looked around the room slowly, the way Miguel had once looked at Sarah's underground palace, taking in details one at a time. The made bed, the shelf of dried-out logbooks, the mended coat hanging on a hook by the door, the rug, faded but clearly placed with care. "How long you been living here?" he asked. 6 weeks. Almost 7. He whistled low, not in judgment, more in genuine surprise. "You did all this yourself?" "I didn't have anywhere else to go," Marigold said, and something in her voice must have carried more than she intended, because Bart's expression softened in a way that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "I'm not going to report you," he said. "For what it's worth, Why not? Isn't that your job? Bart set his toolbox down on the floor and lowered himself onto an overturned crate near the hearth, uninvited but somehow not unwelcome. My job is checking whether these old towers are going to fall into the sea. This one's solid. Solid as it's been in 40 years, actually. Somebody's been keeping the flue clear, patching the mortar around the windows. That'd be you, I'm guessing. Marigold nodded slowly. County doesn't care what happens to Thornwick, Bart continued. Been trying to get them to either restore it or tear it down for a decade. Budget never comes through either way. So as far as my report's concerned, structure sound, no hazard, no action needed. That's the truth, whether you're here or not. For the first time since Bart had appeared in the doorway, Marigold let herself breathe fully. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet. You're living in a stone tower with no plumbing and a dog with a bad hip, from the look of her gait when I came up the stairs. That's not a solution, that's a stopgap. It's what I've got. Bart studied her for a long moment, and something crossed his face, an old grief surfacing briefly before he tucked it back away. My sister lived out of her car for the better part of a year after her divorce went bad. Nobody helped her. I was working offshore at the time. Didn't even know until it was mostly over. He shook his head. I don't intend to make that mistake twice, watching somebody manage alone when I could have said something. He reached into his coat and pulled out a card, worn soft at the corners, and held it out to her. That's my number. Structural stuff, obviously, but also anything else. You need something hauled up here? You need someone to vouch for you with the county? You call me. Marigold took the card. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly now that the fear had drained out of her and left something raw behind. Can I ask you something? She said. What were you doing checking this floor specifically? You said the inspection was for structure. This door, she gestured toward the iron door with the dial lock, still visible in the flashlight's periphery, doesn't look structural. Bart's expression shifted, curiosity replacing the earlier caution. What door? She led him to it, and he crouched in front of it the same way she had weeks earlier, running a thumb along the dial. He said. I've done inspections on this tower 3 separate times over the years. Never noticed this. Must have been paneled over. He glanced up at her. You know what's behind it? No idea. I've tried the dial a dozen times. Nothing. Bart was quiet for a moment, thinking. Lighthouses this old sometimes had to keep her safe. For payroll, sometimes if the light was privately funded before the government took over the coastal system, or valuables from wrecks, if the keeper was the one who processed salvage claims. He straightened up slowly, knees cracking audibly in the quiet room. Might be nothing. Might be worth finding out, though, if you've got the patience for it. I've got nothing but time, Marigold said. And for the first time since Friday morning 3 months ago, she meant it as something other than a lament. Bart left an hour later, promising to file his report as planned and to swing by again before the month was out. Just to check on things, he'd said, though they both understood it meant more than structural concerns now. Marigold stood at the window watching his truck's headlights disappear down the coastal road, ember pressed against her leg, and felt, for the first time in this whole strange chapter of her life, that she was not entirely alone in it anymore. She turned back to the sealed door at the end of the hall and understood, with a certainty she couldn't quite explain, that whatever was behind it was going to matter. It took Marigold 11 days to open the door. She started the way Sarah had once started, with a different lock in a different story neither of them knew about, by assuming the mechanism was old enough to have a common factory default. She spent 2 afternoons at the library researching antique safe manufacturers from the late 1800s, cross-referencing the dial's design against catalog images in a book on maritime history. The librarian had a special order from another branch. By the 3rd afternoon, she had a list of 11 combinations commonly used by New England lighthouse authorities before standardized security became a norm. None of them worked. She tried a different approach after that, examining the dial itself more closely under lantern light, looking for wear patterns the way a safecracker in an old film might. 3 of the numbers showed more scuffing than the others, faint but visible once she'd cleaned the dial's face with a rag soaked in vinegar. She wrote them down. 8, 17, 31. A date, maybe, or a set of coordinates, or nothing at all. On the 11th day, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor with her notebook full of failed attempts, she tried the numbers in the order they were worn, and the mechanism gave a soft, unmistakable click. The door swung open on hinges stiff with a century of disuse, revealing a space smaller than she'd expected, barely 3 feet deep, lined with the same iron as the door itself. Inside sat 2 metal boxes and a leather satchel gone brittle with age, along with a stack of ledgers bound in cracked leather covers. Marigold carried everything to the keeper's quarters and spread it across her makeshift table by lantern light, hands trembling slightly, though whether from cold or anticipation she couldn't have said. The ledgers told the first part of the story. Records from the 1880s through the early 1900s, meticulous entries in a keeper's careful hand, documenting not just tide charts and ship sightings, but salvage claims, dozens of them, from wrecks along this stretch of coast during a period when Thornwick's keeper had apparently served as the official arbiter of maritime salvage rights for the county. Cargo recovered, value assessed, owners compensated, or in a handful of cases circled in a different ink, quietly not compensated at all. The leather satchel held something more immediately startling. Deeds, faded but legible, for parcels of land along the coastline. Land that, according to the ledgers, had been seized from families who couldn't prove ownership after wrecks destroyed their paperwork. Land that the keeper of the time had then quietly transferred into his own name and later sold at a profit to the very shipping company that had employed him. It was fraud, dressed up as bureaucratic procedure, buried under enough decades that everyone who could have been harmed by it was long dead. Marigold sat with that for a while, turning the pages slowly, feeling less like she'd found treasure and more like she'd found a confession nobody alive had asked to hear. But it was the second metal box, the smaller one, that changed everything. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept out the damp, were more recent documents. Property records for the Lighthouse grounds and the surrounding bluff, filed decades after the original keeper's fraud, showing a transfer of the land to the county in 1962 under an agreement that any future development required the county to first offer purchase rights to descendants of the original wreck victims whose land had been seized. A clause apparently inserted by a guilt-stricken county clerk trying to right a very old wrong, and then forgotten entirely. And clipped to the back of that agreement, a name that made Marigold's breath catch. Wrexham, Seraphina's family. Her daughter-in-law's grandfather, according to the genealogy notes scrawled in the margin by whoever had filed the paperwork, had been one of the descendants named in the 1962 agreement, one of the families with a legal claim to compensation from the county for the original seizure. A claim that, as far as Marigold could tell from the yellowed follow-up correspondence in the box, had never been paid out because nobody had ever told the family it existed. Marigold read through the documents twice more that night, piecing together what she now understood. This wasn't really about buried treasure or dramatic scandal. It was about paperwork nobody had bothered to finish, a debt the county still technically owed, and a name attached to it that connected directly, however distantly, to the family who had just thrown her out onto the street with a box and a deadline. She thought about Bart's card sitting on the shelf above her bed. She thought about Odalise Farron, the coastal preservation officer whose name she'd seen mentioned in a newspaper clipping about Lighthouse funding, tucked into the library's local history folder weeks earlier without any particular reason at the time. She thought about Ashby, probably sleeping soundly in whatever house her equity had helped secure, with no idea that his own wife's family had a decades-old, entirely legal claim against the very county now deciding what to do with the crumbling lighthouse he'd never once asked about. Marigold closed the box carefully, set it beside the ledgers, and sat for a long time by the dying fire, Ember's head resting heavy against her thigh, thinking not about revenge exactly, but about leverage and the particular kind of patience it would take to use it properly. She had time. She had documents. And for the first time in 3 months, she had something that felt very much like power. Marigold did not act right away. She'd learned enough by now to know that impatience was how people lost leverage before they'd even finished counting it. She spent the next month photographing every document in both boxes, methodically, page by page, using her phone propped against a stack of books for stability. She made 3 separate backups, One on a cheap laptop she bought secondhand from a pawn shop 2 towns over. One on a cloud account she set up at the library under a new email address. And one on a flash drive she kept sewn into the lining of her coat, a level of caution that felt almost paranoid until she reminded herself what Ashby's lawyers would be capable of once they understood what she had. She called Bart first, not about the documents themselves, but to ask a quieter question. Did he know anyone who handled historical land claims? Someone discreet, someone who wouldn't immediately go running to the county with the story. Bart knew someone, a retired title attorney named Franklin Osei, who'd spent 30 years untangling exactly this kind of coastal property mess before he'd retired to a cabin 20 minutes inland. Marigold met with him twice, laid out the ledgers and the 1962 agreement without yet mentioning the Wrexham name, and asked him hypothetically what a family in that position would be entitled to. Franklin's answer was more than she expected. Compensation for the original seizure, adjusted across 60 years of coastal property appreciation, could run into the high 6 figures. Possibly more, depending on how the county chose to value the disputed parcels, several of which now sat under some of the most expensive real estate in Marrow's End. That's assuming the county doesn't fight it, Franklin said, which they will, unless someone makes fighting it more expensive than paying it. Marigold understood exactly what that meant. She spent the following week drafting, with Franklin's careful guidance, a formal notice of claim addressed to Odalise Farron's office, laying out the 1962 agreement in full, along with copies, not originals, of every supporting document. She included a line, suggested delicately by Franklin, noting that the original ledgers documenting the initial fraudulent seizure had also survived and would of course become part of the public record if the matter proceeded to litigation rather than settlement. She sent it certified mail on a Tuesday morning in early spring, walking the 2 miles into town herself rather than trust the outcome to anyone else. The response came faster than either of them expected. Odalise Farron called Franklin's office within 9 days, requesting a meeting. Marigold did not attend in person. She let Franklin handle the negotiations, communicating her wishes through him, a distance that felt less like hiding and more like the kind of protection she'd never had during her divorce or during the conversation at her own kitchen table that had started all of this. The county, it turned out, had no appetite for a public fight over a documented historical land fraud involving a coastal property everyone had quietly forgotten about. Within 6 weeks, a settlement was reached. The Wrexham family's claim, filed formally in Seraphina's father's name as the eldest surviving descendant, was recognized. The county agreed to a payment of $740,000, along with a formal acknowledgement of the original wrongdoing. Marigold read about the settlement in the local paper, sitting at the library table where she'd spent so many afternoons charging batteries and reading forging guides. The article didn't mention her at all. It didn't need to. She'd made sure of that. What the article couldn't capture was the phone call that came 3 days later, when Seraphina, stunned and half in tears, called Marigold's cell phone for the first time in months, not to apologize for anything, but simply because she didn't know who else to call. "You'll never believe what happened," Seraphina said, breathless. "My dad, apparently there was this old land claim, nobody in the family even knew, and the county just settled. We're getting money, Marigold, a lot of money." "That's wonderful," Marigold said, and meant it in a strange, complicated way she didn't fully examine. "Where are you even living right now?" "Ashby said you never gave him an address." Marigold looked around the small stone room, at the shelf of logbooks, the mended rug, the fire she'd built with her own 2 hands from driftwood she'd gathered herself. "I'm settled," she said simply. "I'm doing fine." She didn't mention the lighthouse. She didn't mention the second set of documents still sitting in the metal box, the ones detailing the original fraud in enough damning specificity that if she ever chose to release them fully, it would unravel not just the county's reputation, but potentially the Wrexham family's own inheritance, since a full accounting might reveal the original seizure had targeted more than one family, and not all of the resulting land had ended up compensated fairly even now. She kept that leverage quietly in reserve, the way Franklin had advised. Not as a weapon exactly, more as insurance. A reminder to herself that she was no longer a woman anyone could hand a box and a deadline. Ashby called 2 weeks after Seraphina did, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of caution. "Mom, I heard about the settlement. That's really something." "It is," Marigold agreed. "Look, with the money coming in, Seraphina and I were thinking maybe you'd want to come stay with us properly this time. Get you set up somewhere real." Marigold looked out her window at the water, gray and endless and entirely hers to look at whenever she chose, and felt something settle her chest that had been unsettled since the day he'd sat her down at that kitchen table. "I have somewhere real, Ashby," she said. "I built it myself." 6 months after Bart Quill first climbed the spiral staircase and found a woman he assumed was a trespasser, Marigold Thistlewood stood at the base of Thornwick Light and watched a construction crew install scaffolding around the tower's exterior. She'd used part of what remained of her savings, along with a modest sum Franklin had helped her negotiate as a finder's fee for uncovering documentation that had also, incidentally, cleared up 2 other disputed parcels along the coast, benefiting the county in ways nobody but Franklin fully understood the value of. It wasn't the fortune Sarah had walked away with in that other story. It was enough. Enough to make an offer to the county for the lighthouse itself, structure and grounds both, under a preservation lease that Odalise Farron, grateful to have the whole embarrassing land claim episode resolved quietly, was more than willing to approve. "You want to buy a lighthouse that doesn't even work," Odalise had said during their one meeting, more curious than skeptical. "I want to fix one that does," Marigold had answered. The restoration took 4 months. Marigold oversaw most of it herself, living in the keeper's quarters throughout, moving her few belongings temporarily into the old storage room, while contractors reinforced the staircase and rewired the light itself, dormant since the 1980s when the county had automated the coastal beacons and abandoned the smaller, older towers like Thornwick entirely. She insisted on keeping the original stonework wherever possible. She insisted on keeping her room exactly as it was, the mended rug, the driftwood shelf, the hearth she'd learned to build fires in with her own hands during the coldest months of her life. The night the light came back on, Marigold stood on the rocks below with Bart, Franklin, and Ember, now moving a little slower but still determined to make the walk down from the tower every evening. The beam swept out across the water for the first time in over 40 years, and somewhere out past the harbor, a fishing boat sounded its horn in what Marigold chose to believe was celebration rather than confusion. 40 years dark, Bart said, watching the light turn. "That's a long time for something to just sit there waiting." "Not waiting," Marigold said, "just unfinished." She opened Thornwick to the public the following spring, part working lighthouse, part small local museum, the restored keeper's quarters serving as a modest exhibit space where she displayed some of the tamer historical documents, the tide charts, the old salvage records, carefully curated to tell the story of the coast without exposing the full extent of the original fraud, which she and Franklin had quietly agreed would remain a private matter, resolved through the settlement and nothing more. The county contributed a small grant towards staffing. Marigold hired a local teenager to run tours on weekends and kept the rest of the operation modest, unhurried, entirely her own. She never told most visitors that she'd once lived here with nothing but a suitcase and a dying flashlight. A few, the ones who lingered longest by the hearth in the keeper's quarters, asking questions about the mended rug or the worn spot on the stone floor near the fire, got a version of the truth. Most simply admired the view. Ashby visited once, that first spring after the light came back on, standing awkwardly at the base of the tower in shoes clearly not meant for the rocky path. He'd brought his kids, Marigold's grandchildren, whom she hadn't seen in the confusion of the previous year nearly as much as she wanted to. "It's incredible, Mum," he said, looking up at the tower, and there was something almost sheepish in how he said it, an acknowledgement neither of them needed to spell out further. "Thank you," Marigold said. "I should have," he started, then stopped, unsure how to finish a sentence that had needed finishing for the better part of a year. Marigold let the silence sit for a moment before answering. "You should have a lot of things, Ashby. But you didn't, and I survived it anyway. That matters more to me now than the apology would." He didn't push further. His children ran ahead toward the tide pools, delighted, and for an afternoon at least, something between Marigold and her son settled into a version of peace neither of them had expected, imperfect and unspoken but real. Marigold still climbs the 31 steps to her room most nights. Ember still claims the warmest spot by the hearth, slower now, but no less content. The light still turns above them both, visible for miles out across the water, a small steady beam where for 4 decades there had been nothing but dark stone and forgotten history. She thinks sometimes about the version of herself who sat at that kitchen table, absorbing the news that her own son was putting her out with a box and a deadline, certain in that moment that she'd lost everything worth having. She hadn't understood, yet that the people who discard you rarely know what they're throwing away or what you might find in the place they assume will break you. She found a lighthouse instead. She found out it still had a light in it. And in the end, so did she. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.